From a nuclear arms race that could destroy the world in seconds, to a concrete wall that imprisoned millions of Germans, to the officer who prevented World War III by refusing to press the red button. This is the Cold War, a 45-year conflict that came closer to ending human civilization than most people realize. Sir, don't do it! But it all kicks off at the end of World War II. Cause when Germany surrendered, everybody celebrated. People flooded the streets of London, New York, and Moscow like it was the biggest global block party in history. And for a moment, it felt like humanity could finally exhale. However, underneath the confetti, a new tension was already brewing. Cause the alliance that defeated Hitler was a marriage of convenience, more like the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of relationship. And once that common enemy disappeared, so did the alliance. On one side stood the United States, young, wealthy, and casually holding the most powerful weapon ever created, the atomic bomb. On the other side was the Soviet Union, battle-scarred, paranoid, and determined to make sure nobody ever marched into their country again. And honestly, I get it. The Soviets had just lost 27 million people in the war. And when you lose that many people, it kinda rewires how you see the world. But here was the bigger problem. Both nations looked at the world through completely different lenses. America championed capitalism, free markets, individual liberty, and democracy, while the Soviet Union pushed communism, a state-controlled economy, collective ownership, and a one-party system that was, let's just say, not a big fan of dissent. Hey, get your hands off me! Each side saw the other as an existential threat. And when two superpowers both believe their way of life is on the line, things can spiral pretty fast. But this tension makes a whole lot more sense when you look at who is in charge. Cause Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist. He purged his own military officer corps, sent millions to die in labor camps, and was so paranoid he trusted almost no one. Stalin's worldview was simple. The West wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, and if protecting the motherland meant installing puppet governments across Eastern Europe and steamrolling any hint of resistance, then hey, so be it. But on the American side was Harry Truman, who suddenly became president after Franklin Roosevelt died. And this guy was barely 2 weeks into the job when someone pulled him aside and said, "Oh, by the way, we built the most destructive weapon in human history." I mean, talk about a fast onboarding. My boy didn't even have a cup of coffee. Here you go, sir. But if you think you could go toe-to-toe with a dictator like Stalin and outmaneuver him, then you gotta play Supremacy World War III, a free online PvP strategy game where you can channel your inner commander-in-chief and lead a nation, build your economy, and fight 99 other players in modern global warfare. Mobilize your army with tanks, jets, and nuclear submarines. And if that's not enough, unlock cutting-edge military tech to destroy anyone standing in your way. Yeehaw! But like real geopolitics, it isn't just about brute force. It's strategy, alliances, and when necessary, a little backstabbing. And right now for Season 19, they have fractured domination, a world split apart, where players fight for global control points in the middle of a nuclear winter. You'll recruit new legendary officers, command elite seasonal units, and battle to seize ultimate power before your enemies do. But my favorite mode is US Battleground, where instead of nations, you can pick your favorite state, invade your neighbors, and expand your empire like James Polk on steroids. And look, as someone who spends a lot of time around presidents, sometimes I think I could do a better job. And this game is the perfect place to prove it. So if you want to try Supremacy World War III, it's available for free on PC and mobile. Just click the link in the pinned comment or scan the QR code on the screen to get a starter pack with a powerful seasonal elite unit worth $40 for free. But let's get back to Truman and his nuclear dilemma. Cause not only did he have to decide whether to use them on Japan, he also had to figure out what to tell Stalin, who was still technically our ally. FDR had planned to brief him after the war, but never got a chance. So Truman walked into a meeting with Stalin holding a secret that could reshape the planet. But unbeknownst to Truman, Stalin already knew everything. Thanks to Soviet spies, Stalin ordered his scientists to build a bomb of their own. He was one step ahead. But here's the thing about Truman. Dude wasn't a pushover. He was blunt, decisive, and deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions. Truman even once said that you never saw such pig-headed people as the Russians, which honestly tells you everything about the vibe between the two sides. But to help the world understand this dynamic, in came Winston Churchill, the British bulldog who stared down Hitler and commanded the world's attention just by clearing his throat. 'Cause while speaking at a small college in Missouri, he finally put a name to what everyone had been feeling. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. The Iron Curtain? I wish I thought of that. It was the perfect metaphor. Europe splitting in two with each side sealed off behind its own political wall. And over the next few years, that curtain didn't rise. It hardened into something close to permanent. 'Cause here's the big picture. After World War II, Eastern Europe was destroyed, and there was a total power vacuum. So the Soviets rushed in and basically called dibs before anyone realized what was going on. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. One by one, communist governments were popping up. And if we're being honest, these weren't elections. This was the Red Army standing in the background like a bouncer saying, yeah, you're voting this way today. The secret police handled the rest, and anyone who resisted was imprisoned, executed, or taken on a leisurely midnight walk from which they never returned. Hey, where are you taking him? So the United States fired back with a strategy called containment, which was essentially, okay, we won't try to rip communism out of the places you already grabbed, but we're not letting it spread an inch further. And at the center of it all was Germany, which had been carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey after the war. The western slices went to America, Britain, and France, while the eastern portion went to the Soviets. Seems fair, right? Well, there was one small problem. Berlin. 'Cause the former Nazi capital sat smack dab in the middle of the Soviet zone, and Berlin itself was divided too, creating a pretty awkward situation for West Berlin, which basically became a little democratic island floating in the middle of a communist ocean. And Stalin, he hated that. He wanted it gone. So in 1948, Soviet forces blockaded every road leading into West Berlin, cutting off 2 million people from food, fuel, and medicine. It was basically Stalin's way of saying, nice city you got there. Shame if something were to happen to it. 'Cause his game theory was simple. Either the Western powers would back off and abandon Berlin, or they'd try to smash through the blockade by force, giving him the perfect excuse to fire back. However, the West found a third option, one Stalin didn't see coming. American and British planes flew around the clock, delivering everything West Berlin needed to survive: coal, food, medicine, and even candy for the kids. They called it the Berlin Airlift, which was not only a crazy logistical achievement, but a PR masterclass. 'Cause it's kinda hard to look like the good guy when the other side is dropping chocolate bars from the sky. Tastes pretty good. Want a bite? So eventually, Stalin blinked. He lifted the blockade without accomplishing a single one of his goals. The West had just won the first major showdown of the Cold War, without firing a shot. But speaking of firing a shot, back at home, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, shifting the entire calculus of the Cold War overnight. How'd they do it? Well, Soviet spies had secretly stolen tons of US nuclear research. And once America realized that, the race was on. Both superpowers started pouring ungodly amounts of money into building bigger weapons. 'Cause by the early 1950s, they had hydrogen bombs, devices roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the ones that leveled Hiroshima. And by the 1960s, they stockpiled enough nuclear warheads to destroy the entire planet several times over. Boys, why do we need multiple world-ending bombs? I think one kinda gets the job done. Let's slow down production. Please. But this gave rise to a doctrine with a pretty appropriate acronym: MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. The idea was simple. If one side launched nuclear weapons, the other would fire back, ensuring both nations ended up in radioactive rubble. Needless to say, there were no winners in this scenario, proving that MAD was completely insane. But also, it kinda worked. 'Cause when the guaranteed outcome of pushing the red button is your own annihilation, you suddenly become very committed to not pushing it. But zooming back out to the world stage, around this time China fell to communism. Mao Zedong won the Civil War, and suddenly the most populous nation on earth had joined the communist bloc. And this terrified American politicians, giving rise to domino theory. The idea that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would topple right after it. And domino theory was pretty much tested right away. Cause in 1950, North Korean forces backed by Stalin stormed across the 38th parallel into South Korea. So the United States rushed in troops under the UN banner and fought 3 years of back-and-forth warfare. And at first, American forces pushed the North Koreans all the way up to the Chinese border, which in hindsight was not China's favorite thing to wake up to. So China responded by sending hundreds of thousands of troops into the fight, smashing into US lines and triggering one of the worst retreats in American military history. As a result, General MacArthur took one look at this disaster and basically said, "Okay, time for nukes." And Truman said, "Absolutely not." And when MacArthur kept demanding nukes in public, Truman fired him for insubordination. Great move, sir. He can't be dissing you in public like that. Anyways, the armistice was signed and the border between North and South Korea ended up in pretty much the exact same spot as before. So after 3 years of war, 36,000 Americans dead, and more than 2 million Koreans killed, the peninsula was still divided. And this proved that the Cold War could absolutely turn into a shooting war. But luckily, both sides refrained from pressing the nuclear button. Phew, close call. But suddenly, everything flipped on its head. Because Stalin died in 1953 after nearly 3 decades of absolute rule. And his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, seemed almost jovial by comparison. He was a bald, bombastic former peasant who denounced Stalin's crimes and spoke optimistically about peaceful coexistence with the West. I kinda like this guy. But wait, don't let the folksy charm fool you. Because Khrushchev was a hardcore believer in communism, a guy who promised that it would bury capitalism. And when Hungary tried to break free from Soviet control, Khrushchev didn't exactly send flowers. He sent tanks. And Soviet forces crushed the revolution in a matter of days, killing 2,000 Hungarians and sending a brutally clear message. Moscow would use whatever force necessary to keep its empire intact. But speaking of any force necessary, in 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit, and it did basically nothing, except circle Earth with a radio signal. Beep, beep, beep. But that beeping petrified America, because rockets in space also meant that they could drop a nuclear warhead on any American city in minutes. So yeah, that whole space race thing, it was really a missile race in disguise. And the Soviets kept racking up wins, like the first animal in orbit, first human in space, and the first spacewalk. I mean, at this point, the scoreboard was looking rough for Team USA. So President John F. Kennedy decided America needed a goal bold enough to recapture the world's imagination. And in a speech to Congress, he declared that the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. It sounded impossibly ambitious. Like, did we really just promise that on live TV, sir? But he meant it. And after JFK stepped off the air, the Cold War brought its most dangerous moment yet. The Berlin Wall. 'Cause in August of 1961, it went up virtually overnight. A concrete monstrosity lined with guard towers, searchlights, and soldiers with orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. It was ironically an admission of failure from the Soviets. 'Cause instead of making communism more appealing, Khrushchev just decided to trap people inside. In fact, at least 140 people were killed trying to cross it. But in '63, Kennedy visited the wall and delivered one of the most iconic lines of the Cold War. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which was basically his way of saying, your fight is our fight. And JFK's speech had me so fired up, I was ready to run through a brick wall. Actually, I'll just wait for reinforcements. But by the time JFK gave that speech, he had already stared down something far more terrifying. 'Cause 90 miles off the coast of Florida sits Cuba, and in 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution turned it into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. And after the CIA's failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro asked the Soviets for protection. So Khrushchev had an idea: place nuclear missiles on Cuban soil, close enough to reach Washington in 13 minutes. What could possibly go wrong? But when American spy planes spotted Soviet missile sites in Cuba, JFK immediately imposed a naval blockade and addressed the nation on live TV. For the first time, the public learned just how close the world was to nuclear war. And when Soviet ships steamed straight toward the blockade line, American forces went to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level the US has ever reached. Nobody panic! So JFK ordered B-52 bombers armed with nuclear weapons to fly constant loops along Soviet strike routes. A not-so-subtle message to Khrushchev. Don't even think about it, Baldy. But then came the single most dangerous day of the entire Cold War. 'Cause on October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine was detected near the blockade line. So American destroyers began dropping depth charges as warning shots. Small explosives meant to say, hey, come on up here, we want to talk with you, pal. But Captain Savitsky didn't know they were warnings. He hadn't heard from Moscow in days. They'd been underwater, cut off from all communication. As far as he knew, World War III had already started, and the conditions on board were hellish. Temperatures soared over 100 degrees because the air conditioning failed. The crew was on the edge of collapse. And Savitsky had a nuclear torpedo, one that could only be launched if 3 officers agreed: Savitsky himself, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. And Savitsky was ready to fire. We're gonna blast them now. We'll die, but we'll sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy. The political officer agreed. That made 2 out of 3. Then it all came down to Vasily Arkhipov, one man in a boiling metal tube under the ocean, standing between humanity and nuclear Armageddon. And he said, no. While his captain raged and explosions thudded against the submarine's hull, Arkhipov argued that they didn't actually know a war had started. They should surface, contact Moscow, and just make sure they have the right information before they willingly blow up the entire world. And boy, did they have an intense argument down there. Some say it came close to getting physical. But Arkhipov wouldn't budge. And without unanimous approval, the nuclear torpedo couldn't be launched. So the sub surfaced, and there was no war. Arkhipov had just prevented what certainly would have escalated into a full nuclear exchange. One man, exhausted, overheated, and surrounded by chaos, made a decision that may have saved human civilization. And thank the Lord he did, because that same day, JFK and Khrushchev finally reached a deal. The Soviets would pull their missiles out of Cuba, and in return, America would promise not to invade the island and quietly remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey. And just like that, the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. And somehow, against all odds, nobody had pushed the button. And let's just say nobody wanted that to happen again. So JFK and Khrushchev established a hotline between Washington and Moscow to prevent future crises before they spiraled out of control. But even with the hotline, real peace remained elusive, because JFK was assassinated in 1963. Khrushchev was ousted by his own colleagues the next year, and then came Vietnam, the Cold War's longest, bloodiest, and most divisive proxy war. A guerrilla conflict where American military strategy built for fighting Soviet tanks in Europe proved almost useless against an enemy that could disappear into the jungle. And by the time it was over, more than 58,000 Americans and 2 million Vietnamese had died. It was traumatic, but at least it helped usher in détente, a fancy French word meaning relaxation, or in Cold War terms it meant, let's not freak out every 5 minutes. 'Cause Richard Nixon, in one of the most improbable plot twists in history, opened relations with communist China, signed arms control treaties with the Soviets, and even had American and Soviet spacecraft docked together in orbit. See, boys? I knew we could all get along. I love détente. Almost as much as I love saying it. Détente, détente, détente. Sorry. For a few years, it seemed like the Cold War was finally cooling off. But spoiler, it wasn't. 'Cause in 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan. They were expecting a quick stabilization mission, but instead walked straight into their own Vietnam, a brutal guerrilla war against Afghan fighters armed with American missiles. Detente was officially dead. No! But when Ronald Reagan took office, he wanted to confront the Soviets head-on. I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire. Evil empire? Okay, this guy means business. And he put those words into action. 'Cause defense spending skyrocketed, new American missiles rolled into Europe, and Reagan unveiled Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system that sounded so science fiction, most experts didn't think it could work. But the Soviets couldn't take the chance. They had to assume it could work. And just like that, the arms race was back on. Again? But this time, the Soviet system was falling apart. A stagnant economy, a losing war in Afghanistan, and 3 Soviet leaders dead in 3 years. It was looking bleak until Mikhail Gorbachev arrived. He was young, dynamic, and willing to admit that the Soviet system needed serious reform. His policies of openness and restructuring were supposed to save communism. But instead, they basically hit the self-destruct button. 'Cause Gorbachev and Reagan, despite vastly different worldviews, developed genuine rapport. And in 1987, signed the INF Treaty, where for the first time of the Cold War, both sides agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals instead of just slowing down production. But Reagan wasn't satisfied yet. He kept the pressure on, and while standing at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, he delivered one of the most iconic lines of the Cold War. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It was part challenge, part prophecy, a symbolic dare to let Eastern Europe breathe again. And I think the message started to work. 'Cause Eastern Europe communist regimes began collapsing left and right. Poland held elections, and the communists lost badly. Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating an escape route to the west. Czechoslovakia erupted in the Velvet Revolution, and every week, another country broke free from Soviet control. But unlike in the past, Gorbachev didn't send in the tanks to preserve their empire. He let it go. And for the first time of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain was rusting away. Which brings us back to Germany. 'Cause when East Germany announced that citizens could cross the border freely, thousands flooded the checkpoints. They climbed onto the Berlin Wall, danced on it, and embraced strangers from the other side. It was a freaking party! Woohoo! In Europe, Germany finally reunified, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and Soviet republics declared independence one by one. In the USSR, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was replaced by the Russian flag, and just like that, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. To everyone's relief, the Cold War didn't end with a nuclear apocalypse. Great work, sir! Let's put that red button away before a future president starts poking at it. 'Cause despite the Cold War lasting 45 years and shaping the world we live in today, no nuclear weapons were ever used after 1945, though we came a whole lot closer than most people realize. Also, don't forget to check out Supremacy World War III. Scan the QR code and get a starter pack with a powerful seasonal elite unit worth $40 for free. But speaking of wars that nearly destroyed the United States, this is the American Civil War explained. From the bloodiest day in American history, to the emotional surrender of a Confederate general, to the president saving America from the brink of collapse, and then getting assassinated 5 days later. If you thought the Cold War was intense, then you aren't ready for the deadliest war in American history. So click right here, so we can avoid going down that road again.